Hey everyone, this is Ali Amagasu welcoming you to the latest episode of Cloud Unfiltered. Today we are happy to welcome Dan Kohn, the Executive Director of CNCF. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Ali. Great to be here.
Glad to have you. We have been doing a lot of in-house guests for a while. It was getting a little too cozy, so we're happy to have someone from the outside straighten us out and let us know what's going on outside our own walls. If you've listened to the show before, you know that the way we always start is by asking our guests how they got into tech. So how did you get into tech?
I think I don't like to think of myself as one of the older guests that you've had here, but I suspect that I maybe have been in tech for longer than most of them. When I was an undergrad in 1993, I started up one of the very first internet companies. And we created a music store on the web, actually even before the launch of Mosaic, which was the first web browser. So it was originally going to be text-based, and then as soon as we saw Mosaic and the web, we knew that that was the future. And so it was called NetMarket. I set up the very first music store on the web, conducted the first secure commercial transaction, had the first commercial database-backed website, and then sold that to a multi-billion-dollar membership services company way back ancient history in 1994, and have been in tech in different ways ever since then.
Wow, that's a pretty auspicious leap into tech. and for the record, if you were an undergrad in 1993, you were not even close to being one of our oldest guests. So,
okay, longest in tech, I guess, was my possibility, and definitely longest on the web probably was the. But anyway, so I started there, and then worked for Intel Communications for Craig McCaw in Seattle for a number of years, including with his Internet in the Sky satellite venture, Teledesic, that Elon Musk now has a kind of a new version of that he's going to be launching with launch costs 1/10 of what they used to be. And then I was a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, and I've been working with the Linux Foundation in different ways for almost a decade now. So I was the chief operating officer there when it was a much smaller organization. Then I left and did a couple tech startups in shoppable ads and trying to improve MRI quality, and then joined back just about 2 years ago as the executive director of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And this is the nonprofit open source foundation that hosts Kubernetes, Prometheus, and a number of other technologies for the cloud.
What drew you to the Linux Foundation in the first place? Were you really involved as a contributor? What was that?
Oh, I just was always amazed by Linux and open source, and just saw it as this incredibly innovative new way of developing technology. And so all the way back at Teledesic, we were using Linux. All through the venture funding I was doing, I was seeing it more and more and taking the place of Solaris. And so when I got to know Jim Zemlin, the executive director, he convinced me to come on pretty early on, and when it was a much smaller organization.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. That was, the primary reason we asked you on. It's interesting. A lot of our guests reference CNCF. They'll throw it off as they're talking about Kubernetes or their involvement in.
Hopefully not in a mean way.
No, not at all. It's mentioned all the time. And I think there's an assumption that all of our audience knows what CNCF is. And I think most do. Some don't, though. And I'm quite certain, though, that even those who know what it is, don't necessarily understand its genesis, don't know all the products that are, the projects that fall under it. And so I think having you on here is going to help, because it's going to kind of round out everybody's knowledge about CNCF. So to start, can you tell me how CNCF started and what its mission is?
Sure. So the way to think of it is that we're a nonprofit open source software foundation. We host projects kind of like the way that OpenStack does, or Apache Software Foundation, or the Linux Foundation. But I think it's kind of more interesting to think of it from an economic and social standpoint, where just go back to 2015, not that long ago, and Google had this pretty exciting internal project they were working on called Kubernetes, that was based on the previous 15 years of work that they'd done with their own internal container orchestration platform, Borg. And they said, okay, we want to offer this through Google Cloud. We think there's a ton of opportunity here, but we want it to be open source, but we don't think it can reach its full potential unless a lot of other companies and individuals get involved in it. And companies like Red Hat and Huawei and very importantly, Cisco, we're all excited about it. We're all on board. And we're happy with the engineering decisions that Google had made to that date. I thought that the project had fantastic bones, but didn't want Google to have full control over it going forward. They wanted there to be a process where contributors, outside contributors, folks from other companies could get involved. So they came to the Linux Foundation and decided to create this sub-foundation called CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And people think of the Linux Foundation as being behind Linux, and it is, and that's still its biggest and best known project. But the Linux Foundation today actually consists of several dozen different sub-projects. The biggest ones are CNCF, Hyperledger for blockchain, automotive-grade Linux, and there's a new exciting one called Linux Foundation Networking, which is a roll-up of a bunch of the different networking projects, which again, Cisco is involved in many different ways. So they came and they created CNCF, and that was just a little bit over 2 years ago. And bluntly, the first few months were a little rough when you have a new software foundation and you have a kind of a complicated structure behind it. And there's just a lot of people saying, oh, what's the purpose of this? What's the messaging? Is this the Kubernetes Foundation? Is it supposed to be more than just Kubernetes? And sort of starting out anything can be kind of hard. And so when I joined, Kubernetes was the only project in it. We have this technical oversight committee that provides independence of technical decisions, and they had some conflicts and some issues with the governing board. And so it's just taken a little bit of time to sort of figure out why we're here and our processes and such. But thankfully, I'm really pleased to report that 2 years later, things are really going like gangbusters, where Kubernetes was just the first project to graduate last week, so that part's going well. We just brought in our 17th project this morning, Nats, that I can tell you about on the messaging side. And so on, and just more generally, I think folks are seeing the marketing value of being part of CNCF and having it as a signpost around project quality to say, not that you must use all 17 projects together. I'm not sure that there's any enterprise that is actually using all of them today, but that, oh, the projects in CNCF are well thought out, relatively well managed, that they work well together, and that there's some values to having it hosted by a neutral body. What do you mean when you say that Kubernetes graduated? Is it no longer part of CNCF? No, we get that a lot. The college metaphor is a little problematic on that side. But no, all the projects come in, the main ones, to an incubating level, and that's just saying that we're going to help them establish some practices, and particularly around governance and how the projects are run. And then when they pass us all of those milestones, they graduate. But it's still hosted by CNCF. It doesn't graduate and leave home. It's sort of Got it. Back home. I hear nothing but good things about the way that community is run, the Kubernetes community, and about their practices. That's nice to hear. I'm not sure that I can say the same thing. I think you're in the middle of it, right? The most negative thing I can say is that it's genuinely one of the fastest growing or highest velocity collaborative environments in history. I mean, only Linux as an open source project is higher speed, and Wikipedia has more people working on it. But when you're trying to coordinate thousands and thousands of developers, and who often are opinionated and have different viewpoints on things, there's inevitably some conflict. But I am really pleased to say that the community now seems to be running quite well. They have a governance structure in place, and a lot of those issues are being dealt with in a way that I think people generally feel like is fair and reasonable. Cool. You mentioned that there are 17 projects now under CNCF. And obviously Kubernetes, I think, is the most well-known. You mentioned a new one, Nats, I think. Can you talk about that one? And can you talk about what are some of the other more well-known ones or the more exciting ones? We think of cloud native as being a destination, and that there's many different routes to get there. And we have a map that we built of the ecosystem that I would encourage your readers to take a look at. Maybe you could include in the show notes. The URL for it is landscape.cncf.io, where you can just go to l.cncf.io. And that lists almost 500 different projects and products in the ecosystem that we're aware of and that we kind of keep track of, and it lets you sort through those and view them and such in different ways. But within CNCF, and we list our 17 projects at the top, the ones that are best known are Kubernetes and then a monitoring solution called Prometheus, which is used pretty much ubiquitously with Kubernetes, but interestingly works extremely well also with Mesos and Docker Swarm and OpenStack, virtual machines, other kinds of environments. And then there's a Ingress project, a service mesh called Envoy. It was originally developed by the team at Lyft and used internally there. And it's a way of deploying how your traffic gets to all of the different services, how the different microservices connect together, and then includes a lot of functionality about how you can deploy out to like canary deploys to new versions to test that things work correctly, and your ingress to the internet, and has some security implications on top of it. And then Nats, our newest one, is a messaging platform. So when you want to do extremely high speed publish, subscribe, pub sub, and other kinds of messaging mechanisms, it really works quite well. Is very well suited for working with Kubernetes.
Is it easy to get involved with CNCF and get involved in any of these open source projects?
It is. Really, the best way to do it is to just engage directly with the projects if you're a developer and try them out. So from cncf.io, you can go to the projects page and see all 17 projects and pick one to download. And then what we encourage is to just try it out. And if you run into problems with it, if there's an error in the documentation, or you see a bug, or there's something about your environment that you need, then please submit a pull request back. And that's really how almost all of the committers and maintainers of the project get involved, is they start with it and have some itch that they need to scratch. Now, for companies, we very much encourage them to become members of CNCF, but I do want to emphasize that there's no requirement to do that. All the software is open source. It's all Apache licensed. Everyone's welcome to make use of it without becoming a member. But we do very much appreciate the fact that we have almost 200 members, including 39 end user members and supporters at different levels, who are both major companies, huge finance companies, very cool, like New York Times, Reddit, Wikipedia, Goldman Sachs, eBay. But there's, I always hesitate to do the list because there's like a lot of other cool ones in there, a lot of very neat little startups. And then another really fantastic way of sort of learning about the community or drinking from the fire hose is to come to one of our events. And so we're doing 3 this year. The first one is just 7 weeks away in Copenhagen. It is QCon Europe. And we're going to have the maintainers of almost all these projects, the leaders of the different Kubernetes special interest groups, and a number of different work groups. And then it's 3 days of talks. And it's a community orchestrated conference. The papers are selected based on a program committee. And it's really grown enormously, where the first 2 of these events 3 years ago were 500 people, and we had over 4,200 folks in Austin a few months ago, and we're actually expecting to exceed that in Copenhagen. And then our biggest event of the year is in Seattle in December, but a month before that, we're going to be doing our first event in China, which will be QCon Shanghai, November 14th and 15th.
Wow. So it sounds, I was going to ask if you did these semi-annually. It sounds like you have them quarterly.
No, we try and do, basically, I guess we do now, but we try and do Europe in the spring, North America in the winter, and then we're adding in China in the fall. So it's a lot. And especially as they've grown bigger, there's a lot of it involved in trying to get everyone together.
When's your next North American KubeCon?
Seattle, December 11th through 13th.
Okay, great. Just for anybody who can't make the hop over to Copenhagen, you know.
Yeah, but hopefully, if you really want to get involved in the community, come to both. But, and then I also want to mention we have a ton of meetups is another really good way of getting involved. And so again, if you go to cncf.io under community, you can see the 130 meetup groups that we have in many of the major cities around the world, and they often meet monthly. And it's another good way to get inserted into the community.
So if you want to learn about it, obviously going to one of these, going to a meetup or going to a KubeCon would be a terrific way. But Do you have other training or certification programs that people can get involved in?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. We do have a free course on edX, which is a really great introduction to Kubernetes, and I'm really thrilled that we now have had 24,000 people sign up for that course from 52 different countries, and so it's pretty cool to see that those numbers keep growing. And then if you sort of take that and say, oh yeah, I really want to, make this a focus of my, software development expertise, then we have a paid $300 course, which is an intermediate level, really get to know Kubernetes. And then with that, you can take an online exam. And this is something that we developed that we think is pretty cool. It's not a multiple choice test. It actually spins up 7 different clusters, and you have to then configure them and fix bugs in them. And it's a little stressful because there's a proctor watching you over the webcam to make sure that you didn't get up and have your friend come and take over. Right. But at the end of that, you can become a certified Kubernetes administrator, which is we've had over 1,000 folks do that, and we think that's going to be helpful from a career standpoint, being able to put on your LinkedIn and such.
So just to clarify, so you pay for the certified Kubernetes administrator course, and but the other one is free, the one that the 24,000 people signed up for?
Yeah, so the introduction, so the Certified Kubernetes Administrator is the exam, and there's an intermediate level course that you can also pay for, but the intro level course is completely free and is a really great way of getting started on this. I mean, so if you like video, I really recommend trying the edX course, and that's, again, you can get to it off cncf.io. For those of us who find video annoying, I also think the Kubernetes.io has pretty good documentation, and you can just go there. And there's also a set of interactive learning pieces where you can go through and spin up a little cluster and try different things with it.
Do any of the other projects that fall under CNCF have similar training yet, or is Kubernetes just kind of way ahead of the rest?
That's the first one, and we're basically looking to add on other pieces to it for some of the other projects. But in general, for this space, Kubernetes is really a good place to get started.
I would imagine. So I don't want to take you too far back, but when you were talking earlier about the 17 projects that fall under your purview there, you mentioned 500 projects. I'm trying to understand how they feed up. Are they not part of CNCF, or how do they all fit in there? Products and projects, I think you said.
Yeah, so we have this kind of crazy diagram, and you can see it if you go to that landscape.cncf.io, and there's a little link right at the top to landscape. Yeah. And what it does is looks at an architecture diagram of the cloud native space and say, hey, orchestration where Kubernetes plays is a really important part of it, but so is cloud native storage, so is cloud native networking, monitoring, tracing, logging, that there's all of these different parts of the ecosystem. And most enterprises, as they deploy this, are going to need at least one solution in each of these areas. And so the idea of this cloud native landscape is that we're saying, hey, cloud native is a destination. That's where you want to get to. But you can pick your own combination of projects, either open source projects or a closed source product or service that can provide these different services. And what we're trying to do is provide some relatively unbiased taxonomy of saying, yeah, here's our awareness of every offering in this space. And so we did this interactive landscape is kind of useful on it because it shows how many GitHub stars the different projects have, how much funding the companies have. It includes the last few tweets, so you can see that they actually still are alive and breathing and kind of what's new for each of them. And hopefully it's going to be a real resource for practitioners in this space as they, when you get started, your initial focus is CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery, orchestration. But later on, when you say, oh, I need a secure storage for my secrets and for my keys, should I use Vault from HashiCorp or should I use KeyWiz from Pinterest? And that ability to come in and see, okay, well, what are the options out there and decide between them, hopefully it's going to be useful for folks.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be tremendously useful. I think especially because it seems kind of agnostic. Just, hey, here's how many stars it has. Here's what's being said about it. Yeah. Use it or don't use it. But I think
we do put a nice little blue box. around the CNCF ones, so you can at least know which our projects are. But we're definitely not trying to say it's the only option for you.
Well, and that begs the question for me, how do you decide what becomes a CNCF project? Because I know, having been involved with OpenStack before, they went through some growing pains where they went with the big tent idea, and they were trying. It was a really good idea, I think, on some level, where we're not going to make the decision for you. We're not going to force you into Nova Network. No. You can go with Neutron. You can do what you want. But I think eventually it got out of control, or it became unmanageable. I'm not sure what caused them to pull back and to kind of shut things off a little bit more, try to control things more. But what kind of guidelines are you operating under? Do you think a Big Ten approach is a good idea or not?
Yeah. Well, the first interesting part is I don't actually get to decide what new projects come in. And the governing board, which is the companies that are funding CNCF, and it's basically all of the biggest public clouds and all the biggest enterprise software companies and lots of startups, they don't get to decide either. Instead, and I think it is partially based on the experience they've seen with OpenStack and ITF and Apache and trying to learn from some of our predecessors, they've appointed a group of 9 independent architects who are top technology folks. So it's folks like Brian Grant of Google, Alexis Richardson of Weaveworks, Camille Fournier of a hedge fund company, Two Sigma. And they take their role very seriously, that projects that would like to be hosted by CNCF come to the TOC. We have 2 calls a month, and they're public, and anyone can participate, and we encourage that, and say, okay, here's our technology, here's how we think it fits in to this cloud-native ecosystem, here's who we're competitive with. And they put together a set of principles which says that all the projects need to be open source, they need to be under the Apache license, they need to be relatively well run. But interestingly, they've not said, oh, and we can only have one project in a box. And so they very explicitly, for example, as in the container runtime, we have both Rocket and Containerd. In the service mesh, we have Linkerd and Envoy. And so there's and I think there'll be more competition going forward even. And so, but what they are saying is, okay, well, any project we accept into CNCF, we do think needs to be a good choice. It needs to be a well-run project and something that we can recommend. And they haven't done it yet, but I know that they're actually fairly eager to also deprecate projects. So at a certain point, if the development slows down enough and technology is going a different direction, then they are going to retire it in some sense.
Interesting.
Sorry about that.
No, okay.
Yeah. And so the other piece, but I don't want to say that our process is sort of totally locked down. There's still an earlier stage that we have that we've called the sandbox, or Inception, but I think we're about to rename it. So there's a little debate going on what the new name is going to be. But the idea is that we would like to have a way for earlier stage projects to get involved. And it is supposed to be somewhat like the big tent idea. And it is trying to shine a spotlight on them, saying, hey, this is a promising project. It's worth considering, worth evaluating, but isn't of the same maturity as our incubating projects, and definitely not of our graduated projects. And so we're still, I would say, refining this and trying to find the right balance between these different pieces to say, the right kind of messaging to potential end users.
So when projects come and they want to be included, or people representing projects want to be included in CNCF, are they coming for the same reasons that Google created it in the first place? Or what is the advantage? What's the advantage of being part of CNCF?
I'd say fundamentally there's 2 basic ones. We provide a set of services to the projects. And so nobody's really interested in hosting today because everybody's on GitHub, and a mailing list isn't that exciting. But the fact that we can help you set up a conference, we've done security audits of our projects, we can pay for different kinds of software tools. So there's a set of services that we offer that are useful. I don't think any of them are sort of life or death, but it is nice, especially because most maintainers are very busy people, and they don't necessarily want to handle what sometimes called the administrivia. And then the other piece of it is the marketing side. And so today, I think many CNCF projects are seen as the sort of standard bearers or the best way of deploying new cloud infrastructure. And so I think a lot of the projects are interested in that kind of Peloton effect of riding with Kubernetes and some of our other projects. And not that when you get into CNCF, things are set for you. I mean, among other things, you have to keep maintaining the project and it has to live up to the quality you've already had. But I definitely think it's the case that when projects come into CNCF, a lot of end users at least are going to seriously consider it and say, oh, I really need to evaluate that. And, you know, maybe I'm not going to use Jaeger for tracing. Maybe I'm going to use some proprietary solution or Zipkin or Skywalking or something else, but I really at least need to be aware of it. And that awareness, I think, has a lot of value for open source developers.
I would think so. That totally makes sense. I had one more question on my list I wanted to ask before we wrapped up here, and it's kind of a large pivot from what we've been talking about so far. It's the Serverless Working Group. I've heard that there's a CNCF Serverless Working Group. Tell me about that.
Sure. So there's I have this kind of funny chart that talks about the history of the cloud, and I go back to the year 2000 when I was working as a venture capitalist, and companies used to come and say, "Oh, I need $2 million to buy Sun hardware in order to launch my app." It wasn't an app at the time, to launch my website, and then I can see if there's demand for it. And so then talking about how much virtual machines with Amazon Web Services and OpenStack changed that now you can turn to CapEx into an OpEx, and sort of transformed that things were so much more cost effective. And now we have this cloud native revolution of saying, well, you can containerize it and it's so much more efficient to run lots of different services together. You can split up your application into microservices and then orchestrate them. And in this chart, I sort of show a new paradigm coming along every few years. And the question would come up, oh, well, aren't containers just a flash in the pan? And serverless is going to supplant that, and nobody will be using this Kubernetes stuff in a couple of years. So we put together the Serverless Working Group to help kind of examine that, and what they've been able to do is a couple useful things. First of all, they just put together a taxonomy and said, oh, these are the different ways of looking at serverless. Here's some of the frameworks. Here's some of the platforms. Here's some ways that you can build serverless on top of Kubernetes, so what we call Kubernetes native platforms. And we've then integrated that serverless landscape that they built into the interactive landscape. But if you want to just look at the serverless piece of it, there's a shortcut, which is you can go to s.cncf.io, and that connects you to the serverless, just shows you the serverless subset. But they're also beginning to evaluate different technologies, and particularly a neat approach called cloud events, which is a way of abstracting out some of the specific event streams that the different major public clouds offer, and trying to offer some interoperability between that. And I feel like what the serverless white paper that they issued a couple weeks ago, that's a very good introduction to the space and read. But what it's really trying to say is that rather than seeing serverless as an entirely new paradigm that's going to kind of destroy the things before it, that it really is on a continuum of how long your services run. So, you know, long-running ones versus ones that can just run for a couple of minutes and stop, how they respond to events. And our belief is that serverless can be a really valuable aspect of the cloud native ecosystem. So that working group is helping to define some of those areas.
That's really exciting. And I think that the landscape that you talked about, the part that's dedicated to serverless, would be so useful to so many people who are really struggling to kind of digest what serverless means. How are they going to incorporate that? Will it be useful? Can you repeat the URL?
Yeah, it's s as in serverless.cncf.io, and I just launched this landscape last week, so I am excited about it. It's worth spending some time and playing with. And also, if you see bugs in it, please open a pull request. It's entirely open source, and it's really meant as an ongoing resource. But I will give one piece of insight into it, which is we pull from GitHub to see how many contributors each project has, what the first commit was, what the most recent commit was. And so then one of the things that we can offer, and that's actually pretty valuable, is to look at projects that sort of came out, were super exciting, folks were eager to work on them, and then they've kind of atrophied. And haven't set these, if a project hasn't been updated in the last 4 months, it's probably not under active development anymore, and probably not something that you really want to adopt for your organization. And we're looking at something similar for closed source to look at tweets, where if you have a promising startup, you're probably tweeting on it at least once a week. And if we sort of haven't heard from you for 6 months or more, then it might be worth having you drop off the landscape.
Makes sense. If you're not tweeting about it at least once a day, you're not trying very hard. As someone who's in marketing.
Yes, that's exactly the case. And so, but it is nice to have that centralized resource, again, when you pick an area like a framework or library or platform and say, okay, well, what are the active efforts underway right here, both closed source and open source?
That's great. Well, Dan, this has been incredibly enlightening for me. Really, I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. Is there anything that you wanted to cover that I didn't touch on?
No, this has been great, and I'd potentially love to come back if you'd have me every few quarters and can tell you about some of our new projects and some of the updates since then. We
would love that. I'm finding we have a need to start recycling guests on the show because things that they said 3 months ago are now old hat. They are.
Yes, I'm going to say, oh, serverless. That was so last month. Now it's all AI and over or whatever it's going to be the next big thing.
So we definitely welcome you back for future visits. If anybody does want to keep up with you besides the URLs you've already provided, are you active on Twitter? Do you have a handle people can follow?
I am. So I'd love for folks to take a look. It's DanKohn1, DANKOHN1. And I'm pretty active there. And it's a good way of seeing at least my perspective on the cloud native world. Excellent.
And does CNCF have its own handle?
We do. It's a little hard to spell. It's Cloud Native FDN for Foundation. So at Cloud Native FDN.
Native FDN. All right, listeners, you got what you need now if you want to follow this Cloud Native journey and the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Dan, again, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to having you back. And thanks for being on Cloud Unfiltered.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
All righty. Bye-bye.